In this video, you are going to master the Caro-Kann defense with the black pieces, so let's start. So, white starts with 1 e4, we play c6, this is known as the Caro-Kann defense, d4, d5, and particularly today we are going to discuss e5. After e5, there are generally two ways to continue the position, which is bishop f5 and c5. I've already in my past videos always recommended you guys to play the move c5 because bishop f5 contains a huge amount of theory, there are many lines, but c5 is, I think, a much more interesting way to play. After c5, it's the best for the French players as well as for the Caro-Kann players. After c5, we are going to focus on d into c5 because there is a huge amount of theory over there. After d into c5, we play the move e6. And after e6, in my previous video, I have already covered the part of a3 in huge and great detail. You can check out that video if you haven't checked out that video yet. After e6, today we are going to focus on the two critical moves, which is b4 and bishop to d3. Starting with 1 b4, which looks pretty sensible. You are defending the pawn on c4. After b4, we continue with a5, already trying to undermine the queen side, the b4 pawn. Already you can't play the move a3, I can happily capture the b4 pawn followed by capturing the rook on a1. You must play the move c3 in order to defend the pawn on b4, where I can happily capture the pawn. And as the b4 pawn is loose now, we can play the move b6 in this position. And after b6, white is having three good ways to continue the position, which is bishop e3, a4, and c into b6. If white continues with bishop to e3, we can happily capture the pawn on c5 first, and after b into c5, we can already play the move knight d7, threatening to winning a pawn black, and then black would be having a good position because of the strong pawn on d4, and a2 pawn is already a weakness. Going back, if white plays the move a4 in this position, which makes sense, and the idea here is after b into c5, white is going to play the move b5. And at the first glance, it looks like white is having two passed pawns on the queen side. It should be scary. But no need to get scared, you can already play the move c4. What is the idea of c4? After c4, you are already limiting the bishop on f1. And second, your idea is to play the move bishop to c5. Stopping any pawn advances, you can play the move bishop d7, eyeing on the two pawns, and black is already having a very comfortable position because you are also having two passed pawns in the center. Going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays a4. Coming to the main move, if your opponent tries to capture the b6 pawn in this position, now you can happily capture the b4 pawn, give a check to the white king, followed by simply capturing the b6 pawn, and now you're already having a strong pawn on d5 and a weak pawn on a2 that you can already capture in the future. And black is already having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move b4. Now coming to the main move, which contains a huge amount of theory, but no need to be scared, it's pretty easy if you play objectively. After bishop d3, developing the bishop. And now what's the idea? After bishop d3, white's idea here is, if we try to capture the c5 pawn in this position, white can play the move queen g4, putting the pressure on the pawn on g7. So going back, first we will play the move knight to c6, attacking the pawn on e5, and provoking white to play the move knight to f3, defending the pawn on e5. And once the knight is on f3, the queen cannot come to g4. So now this time we are finally going to capture the pawn on c5. And from here the main theory begins. After bishop into c5, we have short castle. We develop the knight to e7 as usual. After bishop e7, now there are three main moves to continue this position from the white side, which is a3, knight to d2, and bishop to f4. First, let's try to discuss what happens if a3. If a3, white's idea is pretty clear. White wants to play b4 followed by bishop b2. So first here we play the move a6 in this position, trying to make a square for the bishop to go on a7. That's the whole idea. If you try to play a natural move like knight g6, it's not really good idea because after knight g6, white can play b4 attacking the bishop, bishop b6, bishop b2, short castle, rook e1. And after rook e1, white is having a comfortable position because after something like, let's take, if black continues with f6, white can take here and play the move c4, where white is very much comfortable already. And if black continues with bishop d7, white can play the move knight to d2. The idea is still to play the move c4. So after maybe knight f4, attacking the bishop on d3, white can play the move bishop f1, and the idea still remains the same of playing the move c4. and white is having a better position. So that's the reason first we play the move a6, allowing white to play the move b4. First of all, white is having two moves, bishop b4 and bishop f4. So if white plays b4, we play the move bishop a7 in this position, and after bishop b2, we play the move knight g6, putting pressure on the pawn on e5 and also developing the knight. Rook e1, we shot castle in the position, knight at d2, and now we play the move knight to f4, attacking the bishop on d3. So again, white is having two moves. White can either move back with the bishop, keeping the bishop pair, or white can play the move knight to b3, ready to sacrifice the bishop. If knight to b3, we can already play the move f6 in this position, and the idea is very interesting. After f6, we allow white to take, because if white doesn't take, we are happy to take back the pawn on e5. So after e into f6, now we are not going to capture the pawn on f6 in this position, but we are going to push the pawn to e5, which is very interesting. Our idea is pretty strong. After e5, first of all, we are threatening white to push the pawn to e4. So white will first like to capture the pawn on g7, attacking the rook in this position. And after f into g7, we can already play the move rook f7, and black is already better in this position. You must be thinking how? The position looks complicated, but the point here is you can already see our strong pieces looking at the king side, which is going to bring a huge attack on the white king. So the point here is something like, let's take knight into e5, capturing the pawn on e5. We can already play the move queen g5. White cannot capture the rook because it's mate in 1. So if something like g3, we can already play the move knight h3 check. And the game is actually over because you can't defend it somehow. If king h1, I can capture the f2 pawn and win the queen. If you play the move king to g2, I can play the move rook f2, capturing the pawn. King h1 is the fourth move, and playing the move, like, it's better for black already, like maybe simply moving the rook back, threatening knight to f2 again, and black is already better and winning in this position. So you can already sense how this position is completely winning for black. This is one way if white captures the pawn. If white plays a move like queen to d2, we can already chop off the bishop. White cannot capture the knight with the queen because of e4, so white is forced to capture with the pawn, and here simply bishop g4. Developing the bishop, the idea is to capture the knight. And if something like knight into e5, we can already sacrifice the rook because now the queen is forced to give up for the rook and bishop. Takes. We can play the move queen f6 check and play the move queen into g7. What's the idea? We are not scared of this particular pin because once the knight moves, the bishop is hanging. So that's the reason black is very comfortable in this position already. So going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen to d2 and if your opponent plays knight into e5. So going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight to b3. If your opponent simply pull back the bishop to f1, which makes sense actually. After bishop f1, we are going to play the move queen to b6, which was the main idea of playing the move a6 and bishop a7 to make the square of b6 for the queen. And the idea is to simply put pressure on the pawn on f2. So the whole idea here is after rook e3, black is already very comfortable in this position. We can continue the game via queen to c7, and after queen to c7, the rook is attacked, so the white is forced to move the rook, and we can already make a draw via queen b6, queen c7. It's your choice if you want to make a draw, but you are already having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move b4. Coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays the move bishop to f4, protecting the pawn on e5. After bishop f4, we are going to play the move h6 in this position, and the main idea of playing this h6 and not the most natural move knight to g6 here is knight g6 is having a small problem in the position, which is after bishop g3, short castle, knight to d2, f5, ef6, gf6, c4, and after f5, white can capture the pawn on d5. And the main problem here is if as the pawn is on a3 and a6, it covers the b4 square. So if the pawn would have been on a2, this whole line makes sense because at the end of the line, black is having this knight to b4 attacking the bishop and at the same time capturing the pawn on d5. So as the b4 square is covered in this position, now black is already having a bad position after e d5 because both the pawns are extremely weak. So that's the whole point. Knight g6 is not really working in this particular position because of a3. So that's the reason we first play the move h6. The idea is to play the move g5 in the future. After h6, if white continues with h3, we can already play knight g6. If white wants to capture the knight, he can happily take here, and after queen d3, we can already play the move short castle, attacking the bishop, followed by g5, bishop d7, bishop e8, bishop h5, and black is having a comfortable position. So that's the reason white is going to pull back the bishop, short castle, knight to d2, focusing on developing the pieces, knight to d4 in this position, rook e1, and now knight to f5. That's the whole idea, putting pressure on the bishop on g3. So obviously I don't see any particular move rather of capturing the knight on f5, ef5, and it looks like black is having a isolated pawn and double pawns on the f file. But the main advantage for black here is the bishop is extremely dead on g3. And after e into f5, let's check knight b3 attacking the bishop, bishop a7, and after something like queen to d2, we can play the move rook e8. The idea of queen d2 was pretty simple, stopping f4. So we play rook e2, rook e8, c3, and now bishop to d7. And after bishop d7, if white captures the pawn on d5, we can play the move f4, attacking the bishop, and play the move bishop c6. And after having a queen trade, we are having 6 pawns, whereas white is having 7 pawns. But you can already see the compensation of black having open rooks, open bishop. We can already chop off the knight and capture the pawn on e5 anytime, and black is already having a comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if white plays queen d5. If white plays knight d4, we can play the move first, bishop d4. And after knight d4, queen g5. Now f4 is unstoppable. If you even have a queen trade, f4 is coming up. I can capture the e5 pawn, and black is having a comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays h3 in this position. If your opponent continues with knight to d2, a simple looking natural move of developing the piece, we can already play the move g5, attacking the bishop, kicking the bishop on g3, and now already knight f5. That's our whole idea. First of all, we are already threatening white to capture the bishop on g3, followed by g4, attacking the knight, and followed by capturing the pawn on e5 and having a better position. And that's the whole idea. For example, for the sake of the audience, if b3, we can already take here, h takes g4, kicking this knight and already capturing the pawn, defending this pawn, and we are already a pawn up and having a better position. So that's the whole idea. So yeah guys, that's all it is in the a3 chapter. Now coming to the second move, what happens after knight to d2? After knight to d2, simply focusing on developing the piece, we can simply play the move knight g6, putting pressure on this pawn, knight b3 attacking the bishop, we pull the bishop back, and now rook to e1, protecting the pawn on e5. We play the move short castle, and here if bishop e3 in this position, idea is to capture the bishop here. We can simply pull back the bishop on to c7, putting pressure on the pawn on e5, and now there is no way for white to defend the pawn on e5, so white can play the move bishop to c5, attacking the rook, and at the place of defending the rook, we can already chop off the pawn on e5. The main point here is after knight takes, bishop takes on f8, we are definitely an exchange down. But after queen f8, if bishop into h7, king h7, rook takes, queen h5 check. That's the whole idea of sacrificing the rook. King g8 takes, we can already play bishop d7, and the point here is, it is not a scenario of bad bishop versus good knight, because black is having a perfect center and having the maximum mobility of the center. Black can play f6, e5, d4, and black can play the move rook c8, target the c pawn, and that's exactly why black is having better position. So that is exactly what happens if bishop into h7. If knight d4, we can play the move queen c5, a queen at the best square. And the point here is, after knight f3, we can already trade off the knight and play the move bishop d7. What is the idea, you must ask? After bishop d7, my idea is to play the move bishop c6, followed by e5. Because if we try to play e5 immediately in this position, c4 can be a big of a problem, because after pawn push, takes, queen takes, and there could be a bit problem. So that's why first bishop c6, e5, e4, d4, anything you want. So that's how you can continue this position if bishop e3 is going to be played by white. If white plays c3, the idea is to cover the d4 square. We can play the move bishop c7, attacking this pawn, and after bishop g6, which is the fourth move, fg6, and the position is like anything happen in this position. Both the sides are having even chances to win this game. So first of all, what could be the idea for black in this position? I think the idea for black could be to play the move h6, g5, bishop d7, bishop e8, followed by bishop h5, putting the bishop at its best square. And that's how you can even put more pressure on the pawn on e5, followed by rook f5, trying to play on the king side. That should be how you can play this particular position with the black pieces. So that's how exactly you must play if your opponent plays knight to d2. Coming to the main move, if your opponent plays bishop to f4 in this position, the last move, the idea is to simply developing the bishop and also protecting the pawn. We develop the knight to g6, attacking the bishop, kicking this bishop, and now simply short castling in this position. Knight to d2, developing the knight, f5 in this position, and the idea is pretty clear. We want to play f4 and trap the bishop. So after f5, e into f6, the fourth move, and here we simply chop off the pawn on f6 with the g pawn. And it looks like black's having a weak king, indeed, but black is having a very strong center. And it's extremely hard for white to attack the black king. So after g into f6, c4, trying to open up the center, or else white is simply going to be crushed via e5, e4. So c4, f5, the idea is still to play the move f4 in this position, cd5, and that's exactly why knight to b4 is such an important move. As a3 and a6 have not yet been played, now knight b4 is possible attacking the bishop, and after knight b3 we can already play the move bishop b6 first because bishop was hanging, and after bishop b6, white cannot capture the pawn on e6 because the bishop is simply hanging on d3, so we can happily capture the pawn back, or we can even think of playing the move f4 in this position, attacking the bishop. So that's how you can continue this position with the black pieces. So that's how you play this Caro-Kann defense if your opponent plays b4 and bishop to d3. So yeah guys, if you like this video, then make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. So thank you for watching, and bye bye.